Thank you very much. My job actually today is much easier. I'm not the panelist. I'll be facilitating. So I'll try to not take up too much of everybody else's time. But just to maybe get us started, well, Africa has almost two major divisions, right? There's the Africa of you and me sitting here, and there's Africa somewhere else. When we go there, we're wondering, finally, we are in Africa. There's no electricity, and it's just the place perhaps a lot of the quotes apply to. When you say someone was, actually there's one famous quote, I'm not sure I can remember it, but someone said, when I donate food to the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why do the poor have no food, they call me a communist. So in addition to what type of eggs perhaps we shall be making in the future, or people, whether the eggs are real or artificial. If you are coming from China nowadays, there have been a lot of cases of people selling what they call not real eggs. So perhaps just to get more serious, Africa is growing very fast. I think you heard in the morning that most of Africa will perhaps be the most youthful continent in the world. And by 2030, we will be approximately 2 billion. But the population also that will have no food will largely still be here. So perhaps that's where we should start. So let me introduce myself. My name is Victor Konde. I work with the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. I'm also the managing partner of the African, what we call AEH, the African Entrepreneurship Hub, and also one of the founder members of the African Technology Development Forum, which is based in Switzerland. And we support young people with good ideas. We've been doing it for the last 10 years. Well, I just came back from Lusaka, and I met the first person we funded. And to see him richer than the organization that funded him made us feel very good. So for all those people who are funding, please give yourself at least 10 years. Try not to hope that everyone is going to fly soon. So the people we supported recently, we are still trying to see how long they'll take before they can fly. And given that we've been looking about money and everything else, whilst money is an important aspect, in Africa, one of the biggest problems is simply who to fund. And I still believe that if you have a good business idea, you find the money. There's actually plenty of money in the continent. If you really have a good idea, let's talk and see if we can find the money. So that's a challenge to all of us. I'm not going to introduce them, because I think what I observed is everyone, they sit down for a long time. I talk by myself and then talk about them for a long time. So why don't they introduce themselves so you get to know them better? And each one of you has about maybe, to be fair, 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Dr. Konde. My name is Siabelela Ntutela. I'm the CEO of Africa Bio, which is a biotech stakeholder association based in South Africa and mainly promoting the use of biotechnology in a number of sectors: agriculture, health, and environment. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Reetta Kivelä. I come from Finland and from a company called Golden Green Foods. And I am the CTO of the company, so responsible of the all technology and processes what we have been invented. We are playing in a field of meatless meat, as it was mentioned, so we are playing with oats and beans, Nordic proteins, and we want to revolutionize the world of the proteins.
Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon from me. My name is Dele Rahim. I also come from Finland, like her, and I've lived in Finland now for 30 years. My current work is on food security in the Arctic region. I work at the Arctic Center as a senior researcher, which is in the University of Lapland. But I've always had that passion for Africa. That is where I grew up, and even though I spent 30 years in Europe, I still always try to see what I can give back to my roots. And I think a lot of people here, we are here with a passion to see what will happen in the continent. So I'm looking forward to a very robust discussion this afternoon. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And so what we will do perhaps is we'll discuss one element at a time. And the first, I think, point that we'll be trying to, or point the theme of discussion is, where do you see actual food innovation going in the next maybe 20 years?
Oh, that's a tough one. Look, from my point of view, there's a number of factors that will determine determine at present where food is going. You know, environmental factors, the change in lifestyle of our humans, and technology as it comes. It tells us how even the bare necessity as a food is actually changing. One of the things that we see coming, and which unfortunately is part of our lives, is that food is no longer as it was before, where between the producer and the consumer there's a gap. There's quite a number of processes that are now happening which are determining where the food is going. And such amongst those, and I'll keep saying this, is technology. And I've decided to choose two technologies. One is the obvious, which is the biotechnologies, but the other is the ICT, information and communication technologies, which are shaping where food is going. In the context of African continent is that we cannot continue to plow maize as it was before, plow maize and grind and eat. You know, you've got to start to think, where is this maize going to come from? Do we still continue to plow as it was before, or do we need to look at new technologies of even plowing the maize and planting the maize and getting these crops out of the field? One. Two, should the old seeds continue to be used without looking at how they are producing as in the past was? My opinion is that we need to start to adopt technologies that are being used by the global space except for us in the African continent. One of those is the biotechnologies, the GMOs, the new gene technologies, gene editing technologies, which are now coming to help us to make sure that our seeds and our food are actually resistant to the drought and other pests or environmental factors that are coming in. So in my opinion is that food is going to be driven by the technology. I cannot say what are the kind of foods that are going to come out there because it's quite broad and can be enhanced food, fortified foods, or even new forms of food from non-food products. For example, we see that suddenly people are starting to look at insects as a new carrier for proteins, whether they are modified insects or they are in their natural state, but they are now used to carry new food products that are being used by humans, that are being fed into humans. Second, we're seeing new original species being modified to be able to grow faster, to be resistant to environmental factors, and those are becoming foods that the global space is using, which as Africans in the past we've somehow been taught to be resistant to them, but unfortunately the pressure on food is more on us than in any other economy that is out in the world. Lastly, to wrap up my answer to your question is that if we continue to then ignore the role of ICT in how food is being produced and being used, we're likely to be caught up in the past. There are new technologies that are coming up now where cooking is no longer an issue for any homes. It's going down actually, and ICT is, you can sit down and order food and that food gets delivered to you. In between that, there are many other processes that now get introduced, how it's preserved and how it's packaged and how it's distributed so that you get it in its fresh form than it was before. So those technologies and those new interventions are now determining where food is going. So I cannot say what are the foods that are going to come out there, but the technology has to be embraced as a new determinant on how we package, we eat, we distribute our food going forward.
So after 20 years, this is a tricky question, as you said. So we have been talking a lot in different panels about what is food in 2030 or 2050, and there are very many different scenarios. I think the most interesting thing in the food is that it's something that we need to take inside us. So it's something that we really care about. It's about our health, and we need to understand what we are eating in the future as well. So I think that the local things and all the natural things, they come even more and more important. And if thinking about Western countries and the diets there, so the biggest problem that is killing people is the obesity problem. And we have been now refining for tens of years everything. And now I think we just must go back and stop refining and take only the best parts from the plants and other food subjects. And the other thing is that what we are forced to. So it's quite clear that the environmental catastrophe what we are about to have. So this forces us to go towards more sustainable food. And it's quite clear that if the meat eating, for example, it's growing in Finland, in USA, in Africa, in Asia, we all understand with growing popularity, population, that's not possible in future. So that is something that we need to solve together. How do we have food for everyone?
Yeah, thank you. The next 20 years, if I can look into the crystal ball, I wish I can have that clear perspective. But what I think, from my experience and from what I've read in the literature, we've got to look at the past, the present, then we can address the future. First of all, Africa has the largest arable land for agriculture, 60% in the whole world, and population growth, food security issues. So now I think the question about food is very complex. It's related to several things: economical, political, health, climate change. I work at the Arctic Center, which is the most pronounced part of the world that you're going to see the effect of a climate change. So, food security with agriculture and climate, they are the so-called twin evils. So we've got to make sure that the food system that we have nowadays, I think if we look back, the pre-industrial revolution, before we have industrial food system, it was a little bit better for the climate. But when we have mass production, industrial revolution, then a lot of greenhouse gases were released. It was said that food processing or industrial food system accounts for 22% of the greenhouse gas emission. And to produce 1 calorie of food, you need an average of 10 to 15 kilometers of energy. So which means, and a lot of people have been talking about this, the nexus between food, energy, and water. These are very critical issues. So now, looking to the future, so we've got to find ways to produce food in a more sustainable way, and also include our personal chores. What kind of chores do we make? Because if everybody eats, so what you eat also has an effect on, it's like a demand and supply. So what you eat, for example, people are talking about looking for meat alternatives because, you know, meat, before you get 1 kilogram of meat, they've consumed lots of grass and lots of water. So and that is why the idea of insect consumption is coming up in Europe. Even though in the past, Latin America, Asia, and Africa, they've always consumed insects. It is very new in Europe. It is coming up. The trend is going towards that way because, for example, in Finland, there's insect bread nowadays, also in some parts of Belgium, in the UK. So this is just to see the relationship between food and then the climate, because we got to think about how to feed the population in a more sustainable way. And part of it will also be driven by technology. Digital innovation is coming. Nowadays, people talk about local food. It's very popular, talk about local food. So that means you're going to try to limit how far the food has got to travel. So that means encouraging people in the local areas to also process what they have. Africa is blessed with a lot of raw materials. What we need is to add value, and that needs technology, it needs collaboration, it needs funding. Japan did it. They went into enzymes because they put money into the research into enzymes to revolutionize their food intake. And of course, if we put our money in there and encourage healthy food, not junk food, processed chemical preservatives, no. I think now we should be thinking about, what, if we're going to move from the present state and looking into the future, you got to address these issues of health, of the environment, sustainable feeding, and also what kind of food are we processing? What are we adding value into? For example, in many local African processes, there are a lot of fermented food, which are very healthy. because there's a connection between the gut and the brain. If you have these fermented foods, processed in a very high quality way, they are very good for the health. Then you wouldn't have, for example, it was said that in the UK and Belgium, they're going to save billions of pounds or euro by just getting people to shift their orientation towards eating something that are plant-based. It's going to limit the problems of cardiovascular issues, obesity, and the rest of it, because those diseases are a burden on the National Health Service. But if you can eat the right kind of food, you're going to remove that kind of burden from the health systems. So these are issues that are quite complex, and I think it's something that we all need to collaborate on, think about, and also inform each other about these kind of things. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's true that technology, of course, is going to influence, for example, our interaction also with food, including how, for example, food is transported from one location to the other. Just one tiny thing, just to mention that Africa actually is a continent, so let's not talk about it like a country. In other words, the diversity among African countries is so wide, and so the problems are going to be more diverse. Now, having put just a few of those caveats and the idea that perhaps nowadays it's almost fancy for people to say local is the new global. In other words, you definitely global is already literally in your place. And African cities, which are growing very fast, are attracting a lot of investment, especially in food processing. So that's something that's definitely going to take place. The question is to what extent, for instance, with a new drive of investment, or maybe I should just first add something more to that, that in fact the largest manufacturing sector in many of our African countries, beside mining perhaps, is food processing and the food agro-industries, at least in most of our countries. And whether you're looking at dairy, or you're looking at meat processing, or sugars, or nowadays the confectionaries, and the large companies who make beer, or the ones that are making, for example, like Parmalat and others. So they are already globalizing in one way or the other the type of food that we eat. And there's also, so there is a more or less a danger that food is going to take place in the same way that we have now. African diet is really more about these cereals that have filled up most of our diets. So to help us inform our research agendas, the question perhaps we'll be trying to address is which areas, for example, in terms of research, we should focusing on if we are going to address some of the issues that you have looked at, for example, like climate change, the nexus between land, energy, and water, and to what extent, for example, can we actually substitute some of the, maybe what is already causing obesity, we don't import also bad habits in African diets.
Yeah, look, the problem with Africa is that we have, I think it was mentioned by my colleague, that we have this vast amount of land, and which has this great potential. But almost every food item we eat has an element of it being imported from outside into the continent, with its origin being from Africa. We haven't spent much time to look into how can we use our science to make sure that our indigenous crops, the crops that are growing in our continent, be it indigenous or not, the technologies that we develop in our laboratory are able to apply to them. One, that's the first thing. The second issue is that, unfortunately, generations are changing, and when I was younger, it's different when my kids are now today. I could eat all sorts of things, but they can't. One, because the taste is different, the feel is different, the packaging is different from what they are used to. What stops us then from using the technologies, the knowledge that we've got, into repackaging these food items that we've got, these natural and indigenous crops that we've got, using the technologies that are available to us to make sure that the feel is more appealing to the new upcoming generation, to avoid them instead of eating Kellogg's, which is just maize like the one that we have, but to make sure that even our indigenous foods, they can actually be as appealing in look and feel and taste as it is with the modern foods. That's the first, that's the second part. Then the third issue is that, I mean, our research needs to, actually as Africa broadly, we need to somehow stop this, I won't call it a habit of wanting to be the last to adopt technologies. You know, my feeling is that almost every technology that comes, we want to analyze beyond its analysis and then eventually paralyzing technologies without saying how best do we adopt this technology and adapt it to the needs that we have as a continent. For example, the technology of GMOs, all right? Much as there are so many people that are against it, but science says there's nothing wrong with it, you know. We've spent more time as African countries debating and discussing policies against and policies that are pushing the technology away. And it has actually proven that in one way or another, that could have been one of the solutions that we have, you know, with some of the problems that we've got. There are new technologies now, new breeding technologies. My wish is that we could start to think of how do we develop the science base, the knowledge of that technology, grow our own scientists, grow in the form of train our own scientists so that they take that technology, use it for our own crops in such a manner that we can be able to say, we've got the biosystems, we have tested it our own selves and it works and we're able to apply and use it to address Africa's problem, because this idea of saying let's be the last to adopt technologies actually landed us in all sectors of technology, from vehicles to ICT to biotechnology. I can count till tomorrow morning.
Interesting. I would emphasize on diversity. I think that that would solve lots of problems. For example, if thinking about cereal area where I come from, so we have mainly like 4 crops in the whole world what we are farming. And that affects the biggest environmental problems. It's destroying the ecosystems. It's much more bigger problem than, for example, the carbon dioxide emissions. So, and what is the reason why we have only these 4 crops is, of course, efficiency and, of course, the feeding. But if thinking also the diversity and the technology, knowing how to use the minor crops, for example, oats in Nordic countries, that is really difficult to use, but that contains lots of healthy compounds, and it's only like full of everything good. So in every country, I know that there is lots of science around different local crops, but I think that is the most important thing, just to try to avoid in future these huge wheat lands and try to go towards more diverse ecosystems and also towards more diverse diets. I think that is also an answer for many problems that we have in Western countries.
Yes, I think I will agree with those points quite easily. It's also a question of thinking about the next generation. They're going to be involved in the research process, whereby we should also look at how, what are the ways to commercialize the research findings. And I think this is a very good forum that, from what I've seen so far today, I think it's quite important that we continue to emphasize this, because every region of Africa, they've got their own kind of indigenous crops. For example, I think yesterday I went to the nearby shop near where I was staying. It's a spa shop, and I always take interest in looking at the range of products on the shelf. So there was one that caught my attention. This was Maho. And I think in my student days, I remember, having to read about the different indigenous porridge from Africa, and I think Maho from maize, fermented product. And I thought, oh, this is very good, so I would try it. It's my first time, so I took it. And I tried it. It was banana flavored, and I thought this is something, that we need more of this, because you add value. At the same time, it's also something that that the next generation, they get used to it. So it's not just because sometimes people, if you don't see your product in the like supermarket, people have this kind of attitude to maybe that is local, you know. But if you have something like that, you know, it's something that is, because I'm sure there are a lot of, for example, many kinds of berries or even mushrooms that we can add value to, and they can also be substituted in some of the food that we have to have new innovative products that contain some of these locally based crops, for example. So I think this is something that is, if we're looking at the future scenario, also this is something that, and I think also generally Africa should also take a leapfrog into the digitalization, talking about things like blockchain, AI, to process something, you know, locally, so that it doesn't bring so much stress. Like mass production is more like distributed manufacturing. You know, could be something that we could probably, you know, gain something in terms of with the ecosystem and things like that.
Thank you very much. I think we raised quite a number of issues, from diversity of the food and the diversity of our diets, and the need for us to adopt new technologies, and I'm sure the rest of you are feeling like me, wanting to sleep. So we have one more question for us to look at. But maybe before I say that, I just wanted to, there's something that Gandhi said many years ago, which is that there are people in the world so hungry that God cannot appear to them except in the form of bread. He was not talking about Africa. He was talking about his own country at the time. But actually, if I said that in my village, perhaps they will agree with me. So what I want us to divert our attention a little bit, forget these big cities and everything else that we know, the Pretorias and the Lusakas, Nairobis. For now, if we look at can we think of the Afro-typical, how do we, because there will still be only about slightly over half of African population will be in urban areas. That means a huge population of Africa will still be in the rural areas. And the question is, how can we transform those places? How do we actually feed that population so they can see God in other forms other than bread? And how do we actually help feed the population that is still in our rural communities?
Thank you.
You can start from the other side.
Okay, I've got it already. It's okay. You see, the one thing that we don't control as people is the climate. No matter how much we try, it happens on its own, God's creation, all right? And what happens, and I'll talk about Africa, what happens in the African continent when there's drought is not necessarily a matter of man creation, because we don't have much pollution. And what happens when the new pests come in is not a matter of our own creation, which means then that we should be able to start to ask ourselves as scientists to say, are we too distant from our communities such that the technologies that we have that are able to solve those problems that are not controlled by us, that they can be able to access them? You know, we must bring science closer to our villages and communities, right? We can't expect them to be planting the same system, you know, the old ways of agriculture forever. Much as they can stay the same, but they must also adapt to the changing of times. And it's up to us as scientists. That's why I liked all the projects around here that are done by SANBio, because they show that they take science at its highest form, then they take it back to villages and projects that are not necessarily be seen in nature and so forth, and transform those into core products that are actually needed today. So we've got to be able to bring science to the small-scale farmers, to the rural communities, and educate them about what this science is all about, without necessarily changing the ways they do their own things, but to solve some of the problems that they're now faced with. You know, for example, that of climate change, that of new pests and diseases, and that of decay of food and so forth. You know, without changing how they do things. My view is that science must be based on what the community needs, not what we think the future would need.
Okay, I'm not the right person to speak about this, but yeah, so I would rely on plants also here, even though I have to say I'm not the expert at all. We have problems in other parts of the world, so I've been concentrating on those. But I would concentrate on plants and concentrate on very simple solutions in processing. And I think that is the future, so that we don't go to too complex things, but we want to use as mechanical and as easy processes as possible, and not over-process things. And that's also economically more wise, not to have side streams, for example. And yes, and I would still talk about diversity also here, because otherwise we are just trying our fields and making them not usable again. So we need to concentrate on renewable food.
Yeah, thank you. If I understand correctly, you say how to help the small farmers in the small villages?
Well, how do we feed the people
How
in the...
How do you feed them? Okay.
Getting us fed doesn't necessarily mean we have all of us to dig it, but just we are mindful we have a whole actually still being the predominantly tool for farming.
So,
and most of the food we eat is actually produced locally.
Yeah, okay. So it's got to do with the food security for those people also. So I think food security is also a question of the availability of the food. How do you get access to the food? And of course also, you know, the food system, the stability of it. So I think there are quite a number of things in there to be food secure in such areas. For example, it has to do with what are the available infrastructures, which also has to do with the government, maybe the local government, for example. You know, I know there are some initiatives sometimes in some African countries whereby they just encourage the local people that whatever they can produce, just, you know, farm them, then take them to a particular center where they store them. They just, you know, so everything is in there. Then they have maybe a centralized place where they can add value to it, maybe process it into a kind of flour or something. But of course, for the people who are in that kind of a region, if they are struggling to have access to food, they are food insecure. So that means maybe due to the low level of income, so that means they need ways, because everything has to do with the purchasing power. If you can afford to buy the right quality seeds, for example, so you're going to have problems. And of course, also if there are natural disasters in the region, it's going to affect, you know, the availability of food. So in that case, I think there are quite a number of things, you know, but they need support, maybe from the local government, and of course, if they have means of coming together, maybe as an association. So they say there's a strength in unity. If they have maybe a cooperative, they kind of link together, maybe they have, you know, then they can put their effort, you know, channel it along the same route to make sure that, you know, they are able to get over the situation when there is kind of unforeseen contingencies, so that they have ways, something to fall back to improve their access to food in such times.
Okay, thank you very much. I think a lot of issues have been raised, including how do we organize them in the society so they can collectively adopt and diffuse technologies within their communities, or whether we can easily maybe promote diversity, but in most rural communities, I'm not so sure how diverse our diets are, but that's another question that all of us need to answer. So, not sure how much time we have, considering we've been starting at any time. Let's open up to the floor, and we'll be taking a lot, considering you are coming from actually our own communities. We'll be trying to answer exactly the same question. How do we feed Africa in the next, maybe by 2030, and which tools do you think we should use? What kind of approaches we should take? Quite recently, the World Economic Forum actually had a group of executives that were looking at different scenarios on how to feed the world. So I already see a hand just behind you, and I also see a hand just in front of me. I see a hand from the lady behind in the Undoni Beauty Range. And I see another hand. Okay, let's take those 4.
Thank you, Chairperson. Thank you, the panelists, for the good contribution to the issue of food. I'm Dlamini from Swaziland. I have one specific question concerning the adoption rate of the new technologies that we think could have a good impact on food, or they've been demonstrated elsewhere that they can improve food production. In Africa, we have low adoption rate of these technologies. I give the example of the GMO adoption rate you're talking about. Say. In Africa, I think 2 or 3 countries in the whole of Africa are commercially producing these. What are the possible reasons that Africa should be so slow in the adoption of such technologies?
There was a hand.
Hello. My name is Nailonke. I'm coming from the University of Namibia. My question is almost an additional to what the gentleman said there. We all talked about going back to old processing, going back to old ways of preserving our food. My question is also that let us not forget about the genetically modified food, or whatever it's called. 20 years from now, how are we going to avoid that?
Okay, since I have the microphone, may I just maybe jump in? So I fully agree with the focus moving towards locally available food. It just makes much more sense, right? Now, and there has been a discussion about indigenous ingredients, indigenous foods, the traditional foods and so on. And I'm very aware about the knowledge sharing systems and the complexity about the permission actually even to research on some of the indigenous plants. And then the process to get into even commercializing them. I understand the need for it, but I also see that there is just a hurdle of difficulties to go through that process, which might hold many people away from really developing and promoting these ingredients into more industrial and staple food. It's just easier to make something with wheat than going after some indigenous little grain.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair. I don't have to stand. Everyone can see me. Okay, Chair, thank you very much. I said I'm Tamai. I'm from Lesotho, Department of Science and Technology. So the issue that I want to talk about is on this small-scale farmers that was mentioned, because the case that I'm having in Lesotho, you'll find that these small farmers cut out in the remote areas where there's no electricity, as you mentioned. You'll find that each farmer, they're not in cooperatives. Each one will be able to produce maybe 2 boxes of green pepper, and you'll be unable to market them locally because maybe everyone has. And the other one has 5 boxes of tomato, that all these things scattered there, and they're unable to take this where they're needed. And I think that is a serious challenge. I understand it was suggested that maybe if people of that sort can be in cooperatives, they'll be stronger and do some other things. But I think, as it was rightly said, maybe the local council or whoever, I don't know, but what I'm trying to say is that there are problems already there. These people are not motivated to produce more, because whatever they produce end up being rotten there without them getting anything. So I just want to get the views of the panel, how they think that thing can be solved. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. My name is Elena. I'm from Mozambique. I'm interested to hear your opinion with regards to food production. And I've been hearing a lot about, for example, vertical farming and hydroponic system. So in Mozambique, for example, we get few early adopters of the very basic way of doing hydroponics. We are definitely very far from the more advanced vertical farming. But at the same time, I'm wondering, so Mozambique, for instance, has a lot of fertile land, which is producing at very low yields because of the very rudimental or not advanced way of farming. And so I'm wondering if Africa as a continent has a lot of fertile land, and out of the fertile land that is the few fertile land that is exploited is not producing at high yields. And at the same time, the world is going towards very high yields in urban containers. Aren't we missing out? Or how can we, as a continent, catch up on that and don't lose out on our natural resources, on the potential of our natural resources, while the world is just finding its own solution to produce the food, and aren't we just left with our own fertile land and our problem unsolved?
Okay, if there is no other question, nope. The panel, please.
Thank you. Mine is actually a comment. My name is Petro Sibina. I'm from Botswana.
Where are
and
you?
I think talking
Hello?
about...
Where are you?
I'm actually here, sir.
Ah.
I think everyone can see me. Mine is just a comment in terms of, I'd like to share in terms of what we are doing in Botswana. I think, first of all, in order to ensure food security the next couple of years, we need to make sure that we actually push adoption of these technologies by small farmers. In Botswana, for example, the government has an initiative whereby they're actually pushing and encouraging people for raw planting. They've actually invested in terms of hybrid seeds just so that we can double the output of the available land of production. Of course, for people who are lazy and who normally say they do not have money to actually invest towards hiring of tractors and so forth, the government has got a scheme whereby, you know, the initial 5 hectares, you actually get it for free. So you can actually get free seeds, you actually get free services. I mean, you get tractors for free for the first 5 hectares. And so I think a lot of people are actually getting access, they're actually making use of these available services. But at the end of the day, I think to feed the world, we need to first of all encourage people to start producing for own consumption first, without necessarily looking elsewhere for someone to provide them. There's so much land in Botswana that go unplanted because either people, I mean, the old people used to reside in the villages. Now they've actually, either they're too old to actually tend that land, and you are lacking in terms of the next generation that actually take production to the next level. And so I think, yes, the early adoption of technology is quite key, and the fast adoption of that would actually bring about solution. But like many speakers have said, we still need a lot of work towards encouraging people to adopt these technologies.
Okay, thank you very much. Before I actually ask you to take up all your comments, I was just wondering, no one has mentioned our national agricultural system and how they fit in how we are going to feed the future. I mean, there's no one here actually that comes from the system, or are they all dead? Or more importantly, what role actually should they play?
I have a question. I'm Tendai Bukuta from Zimbabwe. I'm a student doing my 3rd year bachelor's degree. I have a contribution on the future of agriculture in Africa. Well, we are so skeptic about GMOs. Personally, before I started doing biotechnology, I thought, well, GMOs, I will never take those. But then just after 30 minutes of being introduced to the degree program, I would, even up to now, say I'll take them. So fine, Africans as we are skeptic about it. But now, during the summer school 2 days back, I mentioned something about CRISPR clustered regularly interspaced short palindromic repeats. It's a genome editing tool. Fine for Africans are skeptic about genetic engineering. What if we adopt genome editing, which will result, it has less regulations as compared to genetic engineering? Why not harness it and use it for food security? I'm working at the Tobacco Research Board for my attachment, and we are working towards genome editing of tobacco for potato virus Y resistance. This is for tobacco. What if we do it for something which is even more important, food security for Africa? Something that is so important because millions of people are dying each year because of food security. Why not harness this before it's marketed elsewhere? Americans are doing it, but it hasn't been commercialized. What if we do it for Africa and have food security?
Thank you very much. That was a very important question to leave out. So you get about no more than 3 minutes, please, each.
Well, quite a loaded questions from the audience. One thing that maybe I will just say a few things, and my colleagues will also add to it. The question about food waste came to my mind. And I think one bitter truth that I say is that in many African countries, the problem, in my mind, has to do with we lack cold storage because we have warm weather, so most of these things, they tend to go back quite quickly. So if there are facilities for cold storage, there are a lot of things you can do. You have warehouses, maybe transport for cold storage. You can move things around and still keep those fruits and vegetables stable without going back for a longer time. Or, for example, I was in a shop in Finland, and I always go to a shop where I buy plantain. But the plantain, because they go back so quick, so in Netherlands, they've come up with an idea. They slice this plantain into chips, then you put it in the freezer. So I'm thinking, oh, can we do this in Africa? But the problem is, if you have cold storage common in Africa, then it is possible to do something like that. This is one thing, I think my time is up.
So if I understood, there was questions about the processing and about the small farmers and so on. So I have not a lot to say, but just an example of our processing. So we are, for example, combining really old methods with new ones, and then we are using the old methods with new way. So personally, I really think that we can't forget those old processes, because there is a reason why they exist, why they have been existed like hundreds of years. And there needs to be research about GMOs and gene technologies and so on. But the old techniques and old methods, there is the wisdom, I think.
Yeah, I'll try to answer 4 of those questions, 2. I'll combine 2 and 2. The first one was on adoption of new technologies and the gene editing lady, the last one that spoke. In my analysis and having spent more time in this area, I did mention earlier on that the problem with us is that we take technology and we use it as a political tool, and we analyze it and we paralyze it eventually. That is why Africa finds itself at a stage that so many technologies that have come, and we get skeptical, even though we have scientists that are world-class and well-known, they are feeling well in the laboratories, but when it comes to Africa, we come and politicians mingle in it, and scientists, they fuel the skepticism about technologies, and eventually we get stuck where we are, which is why GM technologies has failed to expand beyond the potential of the continent's adoption of the technology. Adoption and adaptation, all right, because we have to adapt it according to our needs. And the lady who mentioned about gene editing, it is true, it's a new technology, it's a new breeding technology, and it's up to us as Africa to say, let's take this one and run, because we've seen how far we failed with other technologies based on us not adopting it. However, this is new and it's not even genetically modified, and it does not need much regulation. But I can see the future coming where Africa is now starting to discuss whether should we regulate this technology and what is it in it for us and so forth. And that is going to slow us again. The second question on the small-scale farmers and the volumes of production basically throughout Africa, we've got the land, we've got sometimes even the crops and the means to do, but we fail to look at maximizing our land. My view is always that if we leave small-scale farmers in every technology that we develop for agriculture, for example, we're doomed to fail because the economy of the African continent has got more small-scale farmers that are feeding communities almost throughout from Cape to Cairo. But we are failing to bring those small-scale farmers together with big pharma and together with scientists to say this is a technology, this is how it's supposed to be. Train them, develop them, and let them adopt the technology. It's up to them to use it. Unfortunately, we can't force anyone to use the technology. But if we don't skill them as scientists, and if we don't give them the platform as politicians, and if big business don't come on the table to say, these are the technologies, use them and feed into us as we produce food, we need you to produce the grain and so forth, that we're going to fail. That is how we've ended up with the same old system of doing things like agriculture is in the 1800s, and the same way of producing food as production is in the 1800s, and the same way we process food as product processing in the 1800s, because the climate is changing, and we cannot expect that food is going to last as it used to be in all those days, because times have changed, and we've got to adopt technologies in Africa, and we've got to also innovate on new ones that will be changing how we do our things, without necessarily taking away the traditions of how we do agriculture before.
Well, thank you very much. We can agree that they are perhaps one of the most disciplined panels in terms of keeping time. Or maybe they are just tired. Anyway, maybe to just keep ourselves reminded of what went on today, we should just keep in mind that well, Africa is a big continent. There will be about 2 billion people in the continent. Approximately 500 million of those will be under the age of 18. Africa's economies are growing very fast, and also a lot of opportunities, of course, for businesses, and the reason why agro-processing has really become a big business, and no one can go wrong in terms of food. So agreeably that, yes, technology is going to play a big role, and perhaps it's upon all of us to think of how we actually perhaps get that maybe achieved. So on that note, let me ask you to give a round of applause to our panelists, and also to yourselves, and of course to me.